Don't argue with my wife in her house. The words hit me harder than a slap. My son Mark stood in the middle of my kitchen, his face red with anger I had never seen before. His wife Chloe leaned against the counter with her arms folded, a faint, satisfied smile on her lips. I could barely recognize the boy I had raised, the same boy who once built Lego houses at my feet while I cooked dinner, the same boy who used to say, "Mom, when I grow up, I'll build you a palace." But here he was yelling at me in the very house I had built from the ground up, brick by brick, for 30 years. It all started that morning over something so small. I had asked Chloe politely not to move the memorial bench in the backyard, the one I built after my husband Daniel died. It was made of solid oak engraved with his name facing the sunrise. Every morning I sat there with coffee and talked to him. It was sacred to me. Chloe had pushed it aside to make space for her new outdoor set. She said, "It doesn't fit the modern look I'm going for." When I reminded her that it was my husband's bench and my home, she smiled thinly and said, "It's our backyard now. Helen, you have to get used to change." Before I could answer, Mark stormed in from the living room, his voice shaking the walls. "Don't argue with my wife in her house. Her house." The words echoed in my mind like thunder rolling through the desert. I stared at him speechless, every part of me trembling. My son, my own flesh and blood, had just erased 3 decades of sacrifice with a single sentence. Outside, the Arizona sun burned bright over the orange trees I had planted with Daniel when Mark was a toddler. I still remembered those early years, the endless nursing shifts, the blistering heat, the nights I stitched my own uniforms to save money. Daniel and I had bought this piece of desert land for $9,000. Everyone called us crazy, but we built our home board by board, working late after our shifts, dreaming of a safe place for our family. Now that dream stood before me unrecognizable. I looked at Mark's furious face and Chloe's quiet smirk, and something inside me cracked, not from anger, but from heartbreak. That morning I realized love without respect can burn faster than any Arizona Sunday. After that morning, everything inside the house began to shift quietly at first. Then, like sand slipping under my feet, Chloe started small, replacing my old kitchen curtains with sleek gray ones she said looked less grandmotherly. She moved my framed photos, Daniel holding baby Mark, our first Christmas in this house, into a box in the garage, saying she needed space for a more modern touch. Mark didn't stop her. In fact, he helped hang her new decorations. When I mentioned it, hurt to see my memories hidden away, he smiled awkwardly. "Mom, you know Chloe has good taste. Let her make the place feel like home." Home. I could barely say the word anymore. The nights grew heavier. I'd hear laughter from the living room, Chloe's friends drinking wine, gossiping about their jobs, while I sat quietly in my bedroom pretending to read. One evening I overheard her tell someone, "Mark's mom means well, but she doesn't understand boundaries. She still acts like this is her house." I wanted to scream that it was my house, but my voice stayed trapped in my throat. Mark began spending long hours at work. When he came home, he barely looked at me. He used to kiss my cheek, ask how my day was, and sit beside me on the porch. Now he simply nodded, eyes fixed on his phone. Every moment, Chloe stood between us like a silent wall. One afternoon, while organizing old paperwork, I found a thin envelope tucked between Daniel's tax files. My heart skipped. Inside was a bank letter from 15 years ago. Daniel had transferred the house title into Mark's name, temporarily when I had been hospitalized for surgery. He said it was just in case. I had never thought about it since, but now staring at that paper my hands went cold. If Daniel never switched it back then legally, the property belonged to my son. That night, As the desert wind brushed against the windows, I sat by the lamp reading Daniel's handwriting in an old card. "You'll always be safe in this home, Helen." Safe. The word felt foreign now. I could feel the weight of something dangerous settling over me. Not physical danger, but the quiet, choking kind that steals peace, little by little. Chloe had taken over my house one room at a time, and now I feared she might take everything else. He didn't even know he held the key to both my home and my heartbreak. A week later, Chloe threw a party without telling me. I came home from visiting my friend at the hospital to find my driveway packed with cars and strangers lounging in my living room. Music blasted through the walls. My husband's portrait, the one that always hung above the fireplace, had been moved to make room for a neon sign that read, "Chloe and Mark's Place." I stood there frozen, clutching the grocery bag in my hand. Someone spilled red wine on the rug Daniel and I bought for our 20th anniversary. I saw it happen, and no one even noticed. When I asked Chloe quietly why she hadn't told me about the party, she waved her hand. "It's just a small get-together. You don't have to make everything dramatic." Mark was outside grilling burgers, pretending not to hear. Later that night, after the guests left, I overheard Chloe on the phone in the kitchen. "I can't live with her much longer," she whispered. "She's always watching me. I told Mark we should move her to an assisted living place. She's too attached to this house." My stomach tightened. She wasn't just being disrespectful anymore. She was planning to push me out. The next morning, I sat them both down in the dining room. "We need to talk about boundaries," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I built this home with my husband. I've lived here most of my life. You're welcome here, but you have to respect my space." Chloe smiled sweetly. "Helen, if you're not comfortable, maybe it's time for you to find somewhere quieter. Somewhere here." Mark didn't say a word. He looked down, his jaw tight. His silence hurt worse than her words. I went to bed early that night. I didn't cry. I just stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner, and thinking about Daniel's old promise that this house would always protect me. But protection wasn't going to come from walls or bricks anymore. I needed to protect myself. I remembered the small silver key Daniel once gave me before he passed away. "Keep it safe," he'd said. "If you ever need proof that you still have power, it's all written down." I hadn't looked at that key in years, but that night as I pulled out the sewing kit from my dresser and felt its cool weight in my palm, I knew exactly what I was going to do the next morning. The next morning, I drove into downtown Phoenix before sunrise. The city was still half asleep, orange light glinting off the glass towers as the air shimmered with early heat. I parked near the old brick bank Daniel and I had used for decades, the same place where he'd insisted on keeping that safety deposit box. Inside, the clerk looked up when I handed her the key. "It's been a long time since this box was opened, Mrs. Carter," she said kindly. I smiled faintly. Yes, I suppose it has. When she left me alone in the small private booth, my hands trembled. Inside the steel box was a sealed envelope with Daniel's familiar handwriting for Helen. "Only if you ever feel cornered." I opened it slowly. Inside laid 2 documents and a folded letter. The first page was a deed dated 6 months before Daniel died, showing that he had quietly purchased the adjoining lot and merged it with ours. But what made my heart race was the signature. The new section of land, the front half of the property, including the main entrance and kitchen, was registered under my maiden name, Helen Monroe. The second document explained everything. Daniel had built the house so that technically it stood across 2 parcels, the front half in my name, the back half in Mark's, which had been temporary for a tax exemption program he was testing. But the letter Daniel left was what changed everything. If you ever find yourself disrespected in this house, remember, it's not the walls that protect you. It's the truth, written on paper. The front half of this property will always belong to you. The house you built with love can never be taken from you without your consent. If they forget whose roof they live under, start with the front door. I sat there for a long time, the pages trembling in my hands. Daniel had foreseen everything, the pride, the greed, the possibility that even family could lose their way. I thanked the clerk, placed the documents carefully in my purse, and drove home through the rising heat. The sky was a fierce blue, the kind that made everything shimmer. When I parked in the driveway, I looked at the front door. Remembering Daniel's words, I no longer felt helpless. That evening, as the sun sank behind the cactus-lined horizon, I made a phone call to a locksmith I trusted for 20 years. It was time to start with the front door. By sunset, the locksmith had arrived, a gray-haired man named Richard, who had fixed our locks since Daniel was alive. He didn't ask many questions, just nodded after I explained that I wanted the entire front section of the house wrecked. He worked quietly as the desert air cooled outside. When he was done, he handed me 2 new keys. "No one gets through these without your permission, Mrs. Carter," he said softly. I thanked him, paid in cash, and watched his truck disappear into the dusk. I made tea, sat in the living room, and waited. The clock ticked past midnight when I heard Mark's car pull into the driveway. Headlights swept across the curtains, followed by muffled voices. The sound of keys fumbling at the front door echoed through the hallway. Then silence. Chloe's voice cut through the quiet. Maybe she locked the top bolt. Another rattle of metal, then frustration. "Mark, the keys don't work." Did she change the locks? I took a slow breath and stayed still. My heart pounded, but not from fear. For the first time in months, I wasn't the one begging for peace. Mark began pounding on the door. "Mom, open up! What's going on?" Chloe shouted next. "This is insane. You can't just trap us outside like criminals." Their voices grew louder, but I didn't move. I sat in my armchair, the new keys resting on the table beside Daniel's old photo. After 20 minutes, the shouting faded into angered murmurs. Then Mark said, "I'm calling the police." When the officers arrived, I greeted them through the screen window, calm and polite. I showed them Daniel's notarized letter and the new deed under my maiden name. The older officer read carefully, then turned to Mark and Chloe. "Legally, this section of the house belongs to Mrs. Carter. You can't enter without her permission." Chloe's face went pale. "You're joking," she whispered. The officers told them to find another place for the night and to handle any dispute through court. I closed the door gently behind them as they walked to the car. Chloe muttering under her breath, Mark silent beside her. The house fell quiet again. The air smelled faintly of lavender from my candles. I poured myself another cup of tea and sat by the window. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't empty. It was freedom. 3 days passed before I heard from Mark again. The house felt different, peaceful, almost foreign in its quiet. I spent the mornings watering my succulents and the evenings reading by the window, half expecting the phone to ring. When it finally did, it was his company calling. "Mrs. Carter," a young woman said gently. "Mark hasn't shown up for work since last week. We're worried. Do you know where he is?" My chest tightened. "I didn't, but I promised to pass along a message if I heard from him." That night, around 10 Husro, the phone rang again. This time his voice came through thick, tired, and slurred. "Mom, it's me." "Mark, where are you?" "At a motel off 7th Street. "Don't worry, I'm fine," he mumbled. Chloe and I were just having a rough patch. I could hear a bar's low music behind him. "You sound drunk," I said quietly. Please go home and sleep, he sighed. Home, I don't even know what that means anymore. The next morning I found a text from my neighbor, Mrs. Lopez. She had seen Chloe at a nearby cafe arguing with a man who wasn't Mark, a tall man in a suit who handed her a folder before walking away quickly. My stomach sank. That afternoon someone knocked on my door. A well-dressed woman stood outside Chloe's sister Vanessa. Her perfume filled the air before she even spoke. "Mrs. Carter," she said smoothly, "I think you've made your point. My sister told me everything. You've humiliated her enough." "Humiliated?" I asked. "She humiliated herself when she forgot respect." Vanessa's polite smile tightened. "Chloe is pregnant. Do you really want your grandchild to be homeless?" The words hit me like ice water, but something in her tone, too rehearsed, too polished, made me doubt it. "If that's true," I said, "then your sister should focus on being a mother, not a manipulator." Vanessa's smile vanished. "You'll regret this," she hissed before storming off. That evening I called Mark again. He didn't pick up, but the following morning my daughter Paula called from Tucson. "Mom." Mark reached out to me. He sounded lost. He said Chloe might have lied about being pregnant. My heart ached. I stared at the front door, the same door I had rekeyed days ago, and whispered to myself, "Daniel, I think we're about to see who our son really is." A week later, just as the Arizona sky began to darken to copper, I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't the angry, demanding pounding I'd grown used to. It was soft, hesitant. When I opened it, Mark stood there alone. His face looked thinner, his eyes red, his hands trembling slightly. "Mom," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." I invited him in. He sat at the table where his father used to read the newspaper every morning, and for a long time he said nothing. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded stack of papers. "I found these in Chloe's bag," he whispered. "Emails, contracts. She was meeting with a real estate agent. She planned to sell the back half of the property, my half, and leave town with the money." I stared at him, unable to speak. "She told me the baby was a lie." He went on, his voice cracking. "She said she only made it up to make you feel guilty, to force you to let us back in." Mark dropped his face into his hands. "I was so blind, Mom. I thought she loved me. I thought I was protecting her." I placed my hand over his. "No, son. You were protecting the wrong person, but you can still protect yourself." Before I could say more, tires screeched outside. Chloe stormed up the driveway, clutching her phone, with a man in a blazer following behind, probably the agent. "Mark," she shouted, "you can't do this. This property is half ours." I stood calmly at the doorway, holding the envelope Daniel had left me. "Actually, I said it isn't." The agent blinked. "Ma'am, legally, your son's name." I handed him the latest document from the county office. "This is the corrected deed issued 2 days ago." "And this," I added, pulling out the notarized trust document Daniel had written, "states that if anyone, family or not, attempts to sell or mortgage this property without my consent, full ownership reverts to my name." The man's jaw dropped. Chloe went pale. "That's impossible." "That can't be legal. It's perfectly legal," I said. Daniel was a careful man. At that moment, 2 uniformed officers stepped out of a patrol car I had called earlier. They asked for identification. I explained calmly that Chloe had attempted to sell property she didn't own, using forged authorization forms I had submitted for review. When the officers confirmed the documents, they escorted her to the car as she screamed Mark's name. He just stood, frozen tears streaming down his face. When they drove off, the desert night turned silent again, broken only by the wind moving through the citrus trees. Mark turned to me. "Mom, I don't deserve your forgiveness." I took his hand. "Then earn it. Not with words, by becoming the man your father believed you could be." Months passed, and peace slowly returned to my life. The house that had once echoed with tension now breathed again, quiet, steady, alive. The morning smelled of coffee and orange blossoms. I could finally sit on Daniel's memorial bench without feeling a shadow behind me. Mark found a small apartment in Tucson near his sister Paula. He called every Sunday sometimes just to hear my voice. The first few calls were awkward, but with time they softened. I could tell he was rebuilding himself piece by piece, learning humility in the silence Chloe left behind. He told me he'd started therapy, stopped drinking, and was working overtime to pay off the debts Chloe had left. "Mom," he said one evening, "I don't know how to thank you for not giving up on me." "You don't need to thank me," I told him. "Just remember what nearly cost you everything." I spent the next few weeks restoring what Chloe had destroyed: the garden, the photos, the little details that made this place home. My neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, helped me repaint the porch, and Paula visited with her children to fill the house with laughter again. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an intruder in my own home. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert sky gold, Paula asked, "Mom, weren't you afraid when you locked them out that you might lose Mark forever?" I thought for a moment before answering. I was terrified, I admitted. But some lessons can't be taught with comfort. Sometimes people only wake up when the ground shakes beneath them. That night I sat outside with a cup of tea, Daniel's old letter resting on my lap. The pages had softened with time, but the ink still glowed faintly in the light. I traced the final line with my finger. "If they ever forget who built this home, remind them gently but firmly." I smiled. "You'd be proud of us, Daniel," I whispered. We found our way back. A few weeks later, Mark drove down to visit. When he arrived, he stood quietly by the bench, the same place our story had broken and begun again. "Mom," he said softly, "you were right. Love without respect doesn't survive." I nodded, tears warming my eyes. Respect keeps love standing when everything else falls. As he left that evening, I watched him drive away under the pink Arizona sunset. His shoulders straighter, his heart lighter. I turned toward the house, my house, and felt an overwhelming peace. Sometimes it takes locking a door to finally open someone's heart. When I look back now, I realize the locks I changed weren't just on my door. They were on the parts of me that had allowed disrespect to slip through. That night, I didn't just reclaim a house. I reclaimed my voice, my boundaries, and the quiet dignity I'd let fade for far too long. Love, I've learned, cannot exist without respect. You can forgive, and endure endlessly. But once respect is gone, the foundation begins to crumble. My husband Daniel used to say, "Home is built with hands but kept standing by hearts." For years I thought he meant effort or patience, but now I know he meant self-worth. When my son finally understood what I had endured, I didn't need revenge. I needed peace. I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I refused to let anger poison the only heart I have. Today, I wake up to the same desert sun, drink my coffee by the window, and feel gratitude instead of grief. The house feels lighter, quieter, alive again. Not because it's mine on paper, but because I finally made it mine in spirit. If my story finds someone who feels small in their own home, I want them to remember this. Standing up for yourself doesn't mean closing doors forever. Sometimes it just means locking them long enough for others to remember who built the home in the first place. Now it's your turn. What lesson did you take from this story? And tell me, where are you watching from today,